She was excessively lovely, often seen in her bikini at California Beach, or indoors with revealing lingerie that adds to her playful nature to depict the homecoming sweetheart and sexy siren, penetrating hearts. Bettie Page was one of the few celebrity icons that was pervasive in their popularity in American society, with an infectious persona. Her image stands tall among those who've massively influenced culture, with notorious pinup appeal. She became the erotic bombshell of the 1950s. And just when fans were salivating over her charm, she suddenly went into a recluse, and by the time she resurfaced, all we hear was shockingly horrible moments of scandals and violence. Make sure to watch the video until the end and leave your thoughts in the comments. If you're new here, join our wonderful community by subscribing to the Matentas channel. They called her Notorious Bettie Page. She's not the usual kind of Hollywood beauty, but her fame was more pronounced than you can imagine. It's possible you haven't heard about the name Bettie Page, but you've probably seen one of her seductive photos somehow. If you've ever seen an audacious display of torsos with countless legs, a petite waist, and an attractive bust line that was capped with a pair of laughing blue eyes, plus opulent brunette locks, the chances are that you've seen Bettie Page on display. The above description matched her famous signature knocks that spellbound millions of American men and women in an era of blonde bombshells. Bettie Page, no doubt, was among the most famous pinup girls of her time. Recall that a few decades ago, pinup models broke the boundaries of societal do's and don'ts regarding sensuality. Images of attractive men and women were like decorative materials, otherwise referred to as beefcakes and cheesecakes. And of all the classic pinups, it's thought that she had a unique standard for showing a risque side. She was the most famous post-war pinup queen Americans knew, and she became the most photographed model of the 20th century. You may or may not have heard of the inside story of the secret life of this notorious model, who left the spotlight in 1957, and how her later life was bedeviled with a series of life-threatening scandals. Sadly, she's no longer with us, but her legacy remains fresh as the office secretary who left administrative duties to become a model that would inspire the sexual revolution of her time. Legendary Bettie Page is still adored today as a symbolic icon, but I'm not sure if the same would be said of her private life, which was far from perfect, not with the less glamorous incidents around her. I was still in an undergraduate journalism class in 1972 when I first heard that Bettie Page threatened her husband and his children with a knife and sprinted, gun in hand, through a religious congregation. I didn't quite understand much about it because I wasn't interested until some years back when her iconic story flooded the internet. Many thought that Bettie had an easy rise to fame with her risque images and became the darling of men, which made her a superstar, even as ladies still idolized her. But she also had a tragic fall in her career. Bettie Page's free-thinking sexuality and unwavering body posture still echo in the minds of many, since her images were displayed more than half a century ago. Her images still fascinate the later generation of fans. Is it true that she's the most sought-after model for the girly magazines, a prototype for sexual publications like Playboy? Bettie Page became the poster child for the counterattack against the titillation of the young American male. Perhaps you haven't heard how this wonderful lady started her adventurous life and career. Born in Nashville, Tennessee in 1923 as Bettie Mae Page, this little girl spelled her first name Betty, B-E-T-T-I-E, as early as she could write. As a child, her parents Walter Page and Edna Pirtle were poor, leading to constant travels in search of greener pastures. Young Bettie had to learn to take care of herself and her younger siblings. That early responsibility worsened after her father was imprisoned for car theft and spent 2 years in confinement. By the time she was 10, her parents had divorced. Her mother took many odd jobs to put food on their table, but the load was too much for her. Edna would later send the 10-year-old Bettie Page and her 2 sisters to an orphanage home. Teenage Bettie had already set her eyes on entertainment, though she had a skill acquisition in hairdressing and makeup. She started patterning her makeup like a celeb, imitating her favorite movie stars, while at the same time learning to sew. This is why years later, while doing her pinup shooting, she had to design her bikinis and costumes herself. Interestingly, Bettie was also a brilliant student, because while at Hume Fogg High School, she was part of the school debate team. Graduating as the salutatorian of her class, plus a scholarship, Betty found herself in the George Peabody College, where she hoped to become a teacher. That early dream changed when she began acting lessons with her eyes set on the movies, though the need to take care of financial needs led her to take up a secretarial job from author Alfred Leland Crabbe while she took home a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1944. Bettie Page was doing her typing job and intermittently modeling while she met her high school lover William Neal, who later became her husband in 1943. Her earliest screen test didn't favor her. Page said she failed the screen test in Los Angeles because she was faithful to her husband. Realizing that being free with her body might just be the gateway she desperately needed, Page stated that she wouldn't mind sleeping with someone to get what she wanted, but that, "I'm not going to sleep with everyone." 4 years after, her marriage with Neal was over, and the following year she relocated to New York City, where she met Jerry Tibbs, the man credited for making her a star. When Tibbs first set eyes on stunning Bettie Page on Jones Beach in Long Island, it was clear that the queen of pinups had just met the self-styled king of pinups. He asked her to pose for a snapshot for his nude camera club, and she consented, a move that transformed her from an amateur model to an instant nationwide pinup star. In no time, Bettie's image flooded international magazines, but it was her 1955 Playboy Center spread that took her modeling career to its climax. The shoot attracted the likes of Irving Klaw, the pinup paparazzo who specialized in captivating photos with models, tied up in rope and leather. Klaw would photograph Bettie Page's image this way and distribute thousands of its 4x5-inch size nationwide, which skyrocketed her pinup image extraordinarily. "I could make more money posing in 2 hours than I will in a week as a secretary," she was quoted. Reports say between 1949 and 1957, about 20,000 mail-order photos of her in bondage attires were shot and distributed, which attracted the attention of an overzealous U.S. Senator, Estes Kefauver, to launch an investigation on the impact of the nude images on youths. But the images, regardless of the inherent excitement and erotic atmosphere they created, caused an alarming controversy. Conservative personalities like Senator Kefauver describe Bettie Page's image and her photographs as a bad influence on society and highly degrading humanity. Kefauver's subcommittee on juvenile delinquency was saddled with the responsibility to probe just how bad of an influence Klaw's activities were on society. The committee was alarmed to discover that the case of a man identified as Clarence Grimm claimed that his son's death was influenced by Bettie Page. When Klaw and his collaborator Eric Stanton were summoned, Bettie was horrified by the prospect of testifying against the people who made her a star, more so on the fact that her personality had been linked to a teenage death. She was deeply worried, even though she was out of danger of legal litigation. 2 of Kefauver's agents had come to Page, seeking information that might implicate Klaw's activities. They wanted her to testify that Klaw was selling explicit and sexually explicit materials. "No way Irving ever did anything like that," she had protested, and added that if she was forced to testify, she would be on Klaw's side. Everybody who saw Bettie Page within the period said she was visibly traumatized by the situation, even though she had no reason to worry, unlike Irving Klaw, who had legitimate legal concerns. Because all she was doing was modeling cheesecake, and it's not against the law. Though it was reasoned that Bettie was afraid for her career and repute the way she would for her freedom. The next part was really sad. Grimm testified that his son Kenneth had died in a terrible way, hanging by his knees and neck. The committee concluded that Kenneth's death was likely caused by Klaw's pictures of Bettie Page. The implication of this is that Klaw and his photography business were destroyed, and with the extraordinary scandal, anger, and fear generated, Bettie Page had no choice but to scamper to safety. It seems Bettie, who was in her mid-30s at the time, made a wise decision to vacate the modeling scene for a better deal for her life. She left town. Observers say that she vanished from New York City for good and left her fans high and dry. Even though the FBI invaded the camera clubs and ordered Klaw to destroy every one of Bettie's images in his collection, he didn't exactly eliminate all of them, the reason that the internet is still flooded by many of these pictures. Before now as a model, Page's image appeared in several films, the first being a 1953 burlesque comedy, Strip-O-Rama. She became a favorite model for photo clubs. The reason her agent and friend Mark Russler once stated that people appreciated how she created less inhibition among people. This was after Bettie Page joined camera clubs, as it was legal to make obscene images, and clubs could do that for nude and knotted images to be displayed as art, and she was ready to display hers, which made her a popular model. While Bettie was living a quiet life in Florida after disappearing from the public eye, Page quit modeling, became a devout Christian, and took theological lessons intending to become a missionary. But her request to join a mission board was declined because she was a divorcee. But she was happy as a secretary for Reverend Billy Graham. Page would go on to have 2 more failed marriages. She had just married, but that one ended as quickly as possible. She married again for a 3rd time to Harry Lear in 1967, a union she was in before her mental health began to deteriorate. With intense bursts of rage, Page raced through a Boca Raton ministry retreat clutching a .22 caliber pistol in January 1972. And by April of the same year, she had forced her husband and her kids at knife point to pray to Jesus, otherwise she would kill them. While she was kept for 4 months under close self-immolation watch, Lear, her husband, decided to separate from her, leading to Page returning to California and living with her brother. But her issue was far from over, because a little argument with her landlady saw her assaulting the lady with a knife. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia and remained in Patton State Hospital for almost 2 years. I also hear that she once repeatedly knifed another woman to the extent of cutting off the victim's finger and severely damaging her face. Luckily, the victim survived. However, the judge declared Page innocent based on her mental state of health. Ironically, she would spend 10 years in custody at the same California hospital. This was beyond madness, as she ended up doing an extended stint in the mental facility. The period was characterized by depression and vicious mood swings. And by the time she regained her freedom in 1992, Bettie Page suddenly returned to the limelight and what seemed like a lucky chance for a second coming of the pinup queen. How, you might be asking? At this time, Page was virtually existing in anonymity and bankruptcy, having struggled with the regrettable conditions for years. Little did she know that her 1940s and 50s legacy would revive her finances as sexual obsessions made inroads into mainstream discussion. Those historic images of Bettie Page became a masterpiece of her attraction and were used in all kinds of merchandise, which critics say helped stimulate dissident art movements. Interestingly, while Bettie Page was missing in the public arena, fans became very curious about her, and a popular magazine hatched in on that to offer anyone who could ascertain her whereabouts, dead or alive, the sum of $1,000. This presupposes that while Bettie Page was battling with her mental issues, a fresh generation of audiences had developed an interest in her. And not too long after, her pictures motivated David Stevens, an illustrator, to create a now-famous comic book character referred to as the Rocketeer. Apart from the royalties Page took from Stevens' work and the renewed widespread fame it provided, the comics brought her legacy story into the popular show Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. Her photos became all-time saleable. Critics say that this might be what Page predicted, because later in life she refused to be captured by a camera. Several years later, and as an elderly, Bettie still expresses disgust over what she likened to ill treatment against Claw. For her, they just ruined his business and put him in bad health, and he ended up dying. She also observed that in the heyday, while those in authority were expected to be ethical in their conduct by conventional characters, judges and doctors were busy making requests of her image from Irving Klaw's bondage pictures. She described it as a double standard. Let anyone do what they want to, as long as they're not hurting anyone. I still feel that way, she stated. She was never ashamed of her past, leaving modeling and becoming religious. I'm not ashamed. Adam and Eve were naked in the Garden of Eden. When they sinned, they put on clothes, she was quoted. Back in her school days at Hume Fogg High School, Bettie Page was voted girl most likely to succeed. And that's what she finally became. We can also say this cute lady with her fearless image was successful in her career, with fame, and even enjoyed an elongated lifespan. Page finally left us after suffering a heart attack on December 11, 2008, having been hospitalized with pneumonia days earlier. She passed away at the age of 85. While Bettie Page's life was filled with struggles, Debbie Reynolds had a story that will leave you speechless. In our next video, we reveal how Debbie wasted her virginity. Click on this video now.